Imagine a world where military promotions weren't based on merit, but on cold, hard cash. That was the reality for the British Army for centuries. But what happened when this system of commissions met the harsh realities of war and a changing world? Did it strengthen the empire, or nearly destroy it? To understand the British Army of the 18th and 19th centuries, one must look past the battlefields of Waterloo or the fever-ridden camps of the Crimea. One must look instead at the ledger books of London banking houses. For over 200 years, the command of the British Empire's forces was not determined by tactical brilliance, bravery under fire, or strategic foresight. It was determined by the depth of a man's purse. This was the purchase system, a uniquely British institution that turned military rank into a tradable commodity, much like a bond or a plot of land. In the popular imagination, the redcoat officer is a dashing figure. He is seen standing tall in the stirrups, waving a sabre, urging his men forward into the grape shot. We see the scarlet tunic, the gold braid, and the air of unshakable confidence. But if we peel back that gold braid, we find a financial transaction. That officer did not earn his place at the head of the column through years of study at a military academy. He did not rise from the ranks by proving his worth. He stood there because he, or his father, had written a check. Consider the year 1815. Europe is in flames. Napoleon Bonaparte, the great meritocrat, who famously declared that every soldier carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack, is on the march. His marshals are sons of innkeepers, coopers, and farmers, risen to the height of power through sheer competence. Facing them is the British Army. At its head are men who have literally bought the right to command. In this era, a lieutenant colonelcy, the rank necessary to command a battalion of infantry, carried an official regulation price of £4,500. To the modern ear, that sum sounds modest. But in the economic context of the early 19th century, it was a staggering fortune. It was the equivalent of nearly £500,000, or 600,000 US dollars, in today's money. It was an amount that a skilled labourer would have to work for 500 years to earn. It was a sum that excluded not just the working class, but the vast majority of the middle class as well. It ensured that the leadership of the army remained the exclusive preserve of the landed gentry and the aristocracy. This was not corruption in the shadows. This was the law. The purchase system was codified, regulated, and open. Prices for every rank, from ensign to lieutenant colonel, were published in official army lists. A young gentleman wishing to become an officer did not submit a resume. He located a vacancy and made a deposit with a regimental agent. If he wished to be promoted, he did not wait for a performance review. He waited for the man above him to sell out or die, and then he paid the difference in value between his current rank and the next one up. But why would a government allow its national security to be treated like a stock market? The answer lies in the deep-seated political fears of the British establishment. In the aftermath of the English Civil War, the ruling classes were terrified of a professional standing army. They feared a military dictatorship where a charismatic general could rally loyal, professional soldiers to overthrow the parliament. The purchase system was the insurance policy against a coup. The logic was brutally simple. Men who owned property would not destroy the system that protected property. By ensuring that officers were men of independent wealth, the government guaranteed their loyalty not to the crown or the general, but to the status quo. These men had too much to lose to ever support a revolution. They were not soldiers of fortune. They were shareholders in the nation. However, this insurance policy came with a heavy premium. It created an officer corps that viewed the army not as a profession, but as a lifestyle. It was a club for gentlemen, where the ability to hunt foxes, drink port, and dress impeccably often counted for more than the ability to read a map or organize a supply chain. As the British Empire expanded, clashing with professional armies and fierce indigenous forces across the globe, The cracks in this golden facade began to show. The system that ensured political stability at home was inviting disaster abroad. As we delve into this story, we will uncover the mechanics of this financial machinery. We will see how it broke the spirits of talented men who could not afford to rise, and how it elevated incompetents who led thousands to their deaths. We will trace the money from the drawing rooms of London to the slaughter of the Crimean Peninsula, revealing how the purchase of power shaped the destiny of an empire. To enter this exclusive world, a young man needed more than just ambition. He needed capital. The journey typically began at the age of 16. A father would purchase an ensigncy in the infantry or a cornetcy in the cavalry for his son. In the mid-19th century, the regulation price for an ensign's commission in a standard line regiment was £450. For the cavalry, where uniforms were flashier and social prestige higher, the price jumped to £840. To put this in perspective, a private soldier in the same regiment earned 1 shilling a day. It would take that private roughly 25 years of saving every single penny, eating nothing, buying nothing, just to afford the lowest rung on the ladder that his officer had simply stepped onto. But the initial purchase was merely the entry fee. The British Army operated on a unique internal market. When an officer wished to retire, he sold his commission to the highest bidder below him, provided that bidder had served a minimum amount of time in the current rank. This created a ruthless game of financial leapfrog known as purchasing over. Imagine a dedicated lieutenant who has served for 10 years. He knows the drill manual by heart, he's respected by the sergeants, and he has led men in skirmishes. A captaincy becomes vacant because the senior captain is retiring. By the rules of seniority, the lieutenant should be next in line. But the retiring captain wants to cash out his investment. If the lieutenant cannot scrape together the £1,100 difference between his current rank and the captaincy, he is passed over. The opportunity falls to the next man down the list. If that man is a wealthy 19-year-old with only 2 years of service but a rich father, he writes the check and becomes the veteran's superior officer overnight. This system created a bizarre stratification within the mess hall. Officers were divided not just by rank, but by their financial velocity. There were the moneyed men who shot up the ranks as fast as regulations allowed, and the hard bargains, the poorer officers who were stuck in junior grades for decades, their careers stagnating until they died or were lucky enough to fill a vacancy created by a death in battle, the only time a commission could be obtained without payment. However, the official regulation prices published by the War Office were often a fiction. In the most fashionable regiments, the Foot Guards and the Light Cavalry, a black market thrived openly. This was known as the over-regulation price. While illegal in theory, it was universally practiced and tacitly ignored by the authorities. To secure a lieutenant colonelcy in a prestigious regiment like the 11th Hussars, an officer might pay double or even triple the official rate. The most notorious example of this financial excess was James Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan. A man of immense wealth and questionable temperament, Cardigan treated the army as his personal toy. It is estimated that he spent over £35,000, a staggering sum equivalent to millions today, on his commissions and on outfitting his regiment in the most expensive, glittering uniforms imaginable. He did not buy a command to serve the state. He bought it to validate his social standing. Under this system, a regiment was not a tactical unit. It was a proprietor's club, and the colonel was the landlord. For those without such fortunes, the system offered a grim alternative. A poorer officer in a prestigious regiment, finding himself unable to keep up with the mess bills and the lifestyle of his peers, might resort to the exchange. He would swap places with an officer in a less desirable regiment, often one stationed in a death trap colony like the West Indies or West Africa, where yellow fever and malaria decimated Europeans. The wealthy officer would pay the poorer one a substantial cash bonus to take his place in the danger zone. Thus, the British Army effectively allowed the rich to outsource their risk. A wealthy man could buy his way up the ranks while staying comfortably in a barracks in Hounslow or Windsor, while a poor man sold his health and potentially his life for the liquid cash needed to pay his debts. It was a system that explicitly monetized courage and commodified survival. It reinforced a rigid class structure where the aristocracy led by divine right of the bank balance, and the middle-class professional was kept firmly in his place, looking up at a glass ceiling made of gold. If the purchase system was a financial theory in London, it became a bloody reality on the Crimean Peninsula in 1854. When Britain went to war against Russia, it sent an army commanded by men who had spent decades perfecting the art of the parade ground and the officers' mess, but who had little to no experience of maneuvering large bodies of troops in hostile territory. The Crimean War would become the ultimate stress test for the concept of purchasing leadership, and the results were catastrophic. The primary exhibit of this failure was the cavalry arm, the most expensive and aristocratic branch of the service. Command of the cavalry fell to two men whose names would become synonymous with military incompetence: Lord Lucan and Lord Cardigan. These two men were brothers-in-law, yet they despised one another with a venomous passion. More importantly, they were both archetypes of the purchase system. They had attained their high ranks not through a demonstrated capacity for logistics or tactics, but because they were immensely wealthy aristocrats who felt that commanding the king's cavalry was their birthright. Lord Cardigan, commanding the Light Brigade, was a man who had famously spent thousands of pounds of his own money on new uniforms for his regiment because he felt the standard issue wasn't smart enough. He treated the 11th Hussars as his personal property, a set of toy soldiers to be polished and displayed. But war is not a display. When the order came at the Battle of Balaclava to advance, the toxic mix of aristocratic arrogance and professional ignorance proved fatal. The resulting charge of the Light Brigade was not merely a tragic misunderstanding, it was a systemic failure. Lucan and Cardigan, insulated by their wealth and social status, lacked the professional habit of clarifying orders or questioning tactical absurdities. In a meritocratic system, a subordinate might have raised a concern. In a system built on social deference and purchased authority, the order was absolute. Cardigan rode his expensive regiment straight into the Russian guns, creating a spectacle of valor that was magnificent, but tactically insane. It was the purchase system's darkest hour. Brave men dying because their leaders had bought the right to be incompetent. Yet, amidst this cavalcade of errors, there stood a stark contrast. Commanding the Highland Brigade was Sir Colin Campbell. Campbell was not a wealthy aristocrat. He was the son of a Glasgow carpenter. He had entered the army at 16 and had spent 46 years clawing his way up the ladder. He lacked the funds to purchase rapid promotion, so he had relied on the slow, grinding path of seniority and the rare vacancies created by death. He was a hard bargain, a professional soldier who knew the smell of powder and the weight of a pack. At Balaclava, while the cavalry was being thrown away, Campbell's 93rd Highlanders stood between the Russian cavalry and the British base. There was no panic, no flamboyant manoeuvring. Campbell simply drew his men up into a line 2 deep, the famous thin red line, and told them, "There is no retreat here, men. You must die where you stand." Because he was a soldier's soldier, a man who knew his trade, they stood. They repelled the Russian charge with disciplined volleys of musketry. Campbell's success was a triumph of professional merit over purchase privilege, a glaring spotlight on what the British Army could be if it valued skill over bank accounts. Strangely, however, the victims of the system, the rank-and-file soldiers, were not always its critics. One might assume the common redcoat, paid a pittance and flogged for minor offences, would resent being led by a wealthy amateur. But the psychology of the era was complex. Many soldiers actually preferred the gentleman officer. In their eyes, a man of independent wealth was less likely to be corrupt. He had no need to embezzle the regiment's food budget or skim off their pay, crimes that a poorer officer, struggling to make ends meet, might be tempted to commit. There was a pervasive belief in the natural leader, the idea that the aristocracy possessed an inherent capacity to command that could not be taught. The soldiers trusted the social hierarchy. They believed that a lord, by virtue of his breeding, would not panic. This social contract held the army together even as its leadership failed. The men endured freezing winters, cholera, and starvation in the Crimea, often without complaint, waiting for orders from men who were busy arguing over uniform regulations in warm tents. It was a testament to the incredible resilience of the British soldier, a resilience that the system exploited to its breaking point. While the soldiers suffered in the trenches of Sevastopol, a different kind of war was brewing back in London. By the mid-19th century, Britain was undergoing a profound transformation. The Industrial Revolution had forged a new and powerful demographic, the middle class. These were not men of landed estates and ancient titles. They were engineers, railway magnates, factory owners, and bankers. They were men who built their fortunes on the principles of efficiency, competence, and return on investment. To this rising class of technocrats, the British Army looked less like a glorious institution and more like a failing business. They looked at the purchase system and saw a monopoly that excluded talent and rewarded mediocrity. They asked a dangerous question. Why should the defence of the realm be entrusted to men whose only qualification was their father's bank account, when the railways and factories were run by men who knew their trade? The amateurism of the aristocracy was no longer just a quirk of tradition. It was becoming a liability to the state. The catalyst that turned these grumblings into a roar was the telegraph. The Crimean War was the first conflict in history to be reported on in near real time. For the first time, the British public did not have to wait months for sanitized official dispatches. Instead, they opened their morning newspapers to read the blistering reports of William Howard Russell, the legendary correspondent for the Times. Russell did not hold back. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of an army collapsing under the weight of its own incompetence. He described the noblest army ever sent from these shores, slowly dying not from Russian bullets, but from cold, hunger, and disease, while their aristocratic officers seemed powerless to organize basic supplies. He exposed the logistical nightmares where ships full of winter coats sat in the harbour while men froze to death a few miles away, simply because the officers in charge lacked the administrative skills to unload them. These reports shocked the Victorian conscience. The public began to see the purchase system not as a guarantor of stability, but as a source of national shame. Letters flooded into the newspapers, demanding to know why merit was a foreign word in the War Office. The disastrous performance in the Crimea shattered the illusion of aristocratic invincibility. It became clear that bravery alone was not enough in the industrial age. Warfare now required professionalism, logistics, and technical expertise, qualities that could not be bought. Within the army itself, voices of dissent began to rise, though they were often drowned out by the establishment. Professional officers, those hard bargains who had spent their lives studying the art of war, began to advocate for a system where promotion was based on exams and field reports. They pointed to the rising power of Prussia, a continental rival whose army was led by a highly trained general staff, a meritocracy of the intellect. The comparison was stark and terrifying. If Britain ever had to fight a first-rate European power on land, the gentlemen amateurs would be annihilated. Yet, the resistance to reform was fierce. The defenders of the purchase system argued that abolishing it would destroy the regimental system. They claimed that a professional officer corps would become a distinct caste, separated from civilian life and potentially dangerous to liberty, the old fear of the military dictatorship resurfacing. They argued that the purchase system ensured that officers were gentlemen first and officers second, binding the army to the social order. But as the casualty lists grew longer and the stories of incompetence grew louder, these arguments began to ring hollow. The cracks in the system were no longer whispers. They were becoming a roar that the government could no longer ignore. The roar for reform finally found its champion in 1868, not on the battlefield, but in the halls of Westminster. The new Liberal government, led by William Gladstone, appointed Edward Cardwell as Secretary of State for War. Cardwell was the antithesis of the dashing cavalry officer. He was a lawyer, a politician, a man of ledgers and logic. He looked at the British Army and saw a broken machine. He realized that no amount of better training or new weaponry would matter, as long as the officers owned their ranks. To professionalize the army, he had to nationalize the officer corps. But declaring the end of the purchase system was one thing. Actually abolishing it was a political nightmare. Cardwell wasn't just proposing a change in military policy. He was attacking the sanctity of private property, the very cornerstone of Victorian society. The opposition was ferocious. In the House of Commons and the House of Lords, a powerful bloc known as the Colonels rose to fight him. These were MPs and peers who were either former officers themselves or had heavy investments in the system. They viewed Cardwell's proposal not as reform, but as robbery. They argued that they had paid good money for their commissions under the existing laws of the land. To strip them of that value without their consent was, they claimed, unconstitutional and un-British. The debates raged for months in 1871. The colonels filibustered, delayed and obstructed. They painted apocalyptic visions of an army led by bookworms and socialists, stripped of the gentlemanly honour that had built the empire. They raised the spectre of the French Revolution, warning that a professional army would eventually turn on its masters. It was a clash of two worlds, the old feudal order of patronage and privilege against the new industrial order of merit and efficiency. The bill to abolish purchase narrowly scraped through the House of Commons, but it hit a brick wall in the House of Lords. The Lords, the bastion of the aristocracy, rejected the bill. It seemed the reform was dead in the water. The vested interests had won. The checkbook would remain mightier than the sword. But Cardwell and Gladstone had a trump card, a legal loophole that would shock the establishment. They discovered that the purchase system had never actually been established by an Act of Parliament. It had been created centuries earlier by a royal warrant, a direct decree from the monarch. Therefore, legally, it did not need Parliament's permission to be removed. It only needed the Queen's signature. In a move of breathtaking constitutional audacity, the government bypassed the House of Lords entirely. They went directly to Queen Victoria. The Queen, though sympathetic to the traditionalists, was persuaded that the efficiency of her army and the safety of her realm depended on this change. On July 20th, 1871, she signed the royal warrant abolishing the purchase of commissions. The aristocracy was stunned. They had been outmaneuvered by the very institution they claimed to protect, the Crown. The purchase system, which had defined British military leadership for over 2 centuries, was wiped away with the stroke of a pen. But the victory came with a massive price tag. The government could not simply confiscate the officers' property. To avoid a complete mutiny of the upper classes, the state had to agree to buy them out. The financial scale of this buyout was astronomical. The government committed to compensating every officer for the regulation price of their commission. The bill for this nationalisation of the army eventually totalled £7 million. In today's terms, this would be billions, a massive transfer of wealth from the public taxpayer to the private pockets of the officer class. It was the golden parachute to end all golden parachutes. The officers would leave the system, but they would take their money with them. The British taxpayer effectively bought their own army back from its commanders, settling the final invoice for centuries of aristocratic privilege. On the morning of November 1st, 1871, the British Army woke up to a new legal reality. The purchase system was dead. In theory, the path to command was now open to any man with the talent to seize it. The newspapers hailed the dawn of a meritocratic age. But those expecting an overnight revolution were destined for disappointment. The royal warrant had changed the rules of the game, But it had not changed the players. In the mess halls of Aldershot and the Curragh, the faces remained the same. The accents remained the same. The names were still drawn from Burke's peerage and the landed gentry. Why? Because while the government had abolished the entry fee, they had neglected to address the maintenance cost. The salary of a junior officer in the 1870s was practically identical to what it had been in the days of Queen Anne, a century earlier. A lieutenant was paid roughly 5 shillings and 3 pence a day. Yet the mandatory expenses of mess life, the subscriptions for regimental bands, the cost of formal dinners, the upkeep of dress uniforms, and the stabling of polo ponies far exceeded this paltry sum. It was estimated that an officer in an infantry regiment needed a private allowance from his father of at least £100 a year just to avoid debt. In the cavalry, that figure was closer to £500 or £600. So, while the legal requirement to buy a commission was gone, the economic barrier remained an iron gate. The son of a grocer or a clerk might pass the entrance exam, but he could not afford to be an officer. The army effectively said, "You no longer have to pay us £450 to join, but you must be rich enough to work for free." This ensured that the officer corps remained a preserve of the wealthy, filtering out the undesirables of the lower classes just as effectively as the old price tags had. However, a subtle shift began to occur in how that wealth was deployed. Under the old system, money bought rank directly. Under the new system, money bought education. The entrance to the officer corps was now governed by competitive examination. To pass these rigorous tests in mathematics, languages and history, a young gentleman needed expensive schooling. This gave rise to a new industry, the crammers. These were specialized private tutors who charged exorbitant fees to drill facts and formulas into the heads of wealthy young men until they could regurgitate them for the examiners. The checkbook was still the deciding factor, but it was now writing checks to tutors rather than regimental agents. Inside the regiments, a bitter culture war erupted. The old-school officers, who had purchased their commissions, looked with deep suspicion at the new intake. They derided these exam-qualified newcomers as competition wallers or bookworms, insinuating that they were socially inferior and practically useless. There was a genuine fear among the traditionalists that these new officers would be too intellectual, too focused on theory, and lacking the sporting instinct and cavalier dash they believed was essential for leadership. Yet, despite this resistance, the seed of professionalism had been planted. The army began to attract a different kind of mind, men who viewed soldiering as a serious career rather than an adventurous hobby. The figurehead of this new era was Sir Garnet Wolseley. Wolseley was a relentless modernizer, a man who despised the bow and arrow generals of the past. He gathered around him a circle of like-minded, intellectually rigorous officers known as the Wolseley Ring. These men studied the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. They wrote manuals on logistics and tactics. They argued that an officer's duty was to be efficient, not just gallant. Slowly, agonizingly, the culture began to pivot. The gentleman amateur was not extinct, but he was becoming an endangered species. The chaotic feudal assembly of private regiments was slowly being forged into a standardized, professional instrument of state power. Just in time, for the empire was about to demand more from its soldiers than ever before. The true audit of these reforms came at the turn of the century, on the dusty plains of South Africa. The Second Boer War was the final exam for the Victorian army and the first test for the modern one. Initially, it seemed that little had changed. British generals, still drawn largely from the upper crust, marched into Black Week in 1899, suffering humiliating defeats at the hands of Boer farmers. The ghosts of the Crimea seemed to be stirring, the arrogance of the mess hall once again underestimating the reality of the rifle. But there was a critical difference. In 1854, the system had paralyzed itself. In 1899, the system adapted. The new breed of staff officers, men trained in logistics and movement rather than just fox hunting, began to take control. They reorganized, They strategized, and they ground out a victory. It was ugly and it was costly, but it was a victory of professional management over amateur heroism. The army was no longer a rigid, brittle structure. It was becoming a learning organization. This evolution culminated in August 1914, when the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, landed in France to face the might of the German Imperial Army. It was small, a contemptible little army, as the Kaiser supposedly sneered. But it was, pound for pound, the finest fighting force Britain had ever fielded. The lieutenants and captains leading these men had not bought their commissions. They had passed out of the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. They had attended the Staff College at Camberley. They were professionals who treated war as a science. At the Battle of Mons, the British infantry fired their Lee-Enfield rifles with such speed and accuracy, the famous Mad Minute, that the Germans believed they were facing machine guns. This level of discipline and lethality was the direct dividend of the £7 million spent to abolish the purchase system. It was the return on investment that Cardwell had promised. The abolition of purchase did not destroy the class system in Britain. The officer corps remained dominated by the public school elite well into the 20th century. But it destroyed the entitlement of that class. It severed the toxic link between personal wealth and military command. It established the fundamental principle that an officer's authority is derived from his competence and his commission from the Crown, not his bank balance. This shift rippled outwards, influencing the very concept of public service in Britain. If the army, the most traditional and aristocratic of all institutions, could be professionalized, then so could the civil service, the diplomatic corps, and the judiciary. The fall of the purchase system was the bellwether for the decline of the old patronage society and the rise of the modern meritocratic state. Yet, the legacy carries a warning. The purchase system endured for centuries, not because it was efficient, but because it benefited those in power. It was a comfortable arrangement for the wealthy, who saw the army as their playground, and for the government, which saved money on pensions and salaries. It took a catastrophe, the unnecessary deaths of thousands of soldiers, to break that comfortable deadlock. It stands as a stark historical reminder that institutions often resist necessary change until the cost of the status quo becomes paid in blood. As we look back at the Redcoat era, we must see beyond the romanticism of the scarlet tunic. We must see the cold financial calculus that underpinned it. The thin red line was held by brave men, but it was drawn by rich men. The story of the British Army's transformation is the story of how a nation learned that while you can buy a rank, you cannot buy leadership. The journey from the auction block to the Staff College was long and fiercely contested. It reveals a fundamental truth about the British Empire. Its greatest battles were often fought not against foreign enemies, but against its own archaic traditions. The Redcoat Army that conquered a quarter of the globe was a paradox, a force of immense destructive power, hobbled by a leadership structure that belonged in the Middle Ages. Today, the British Army is one of the most professional fighting forces in the world. An officer's promotion depends on rigorous assessment, continuous training, and demonstrated ability. The idea that a 19-year-old could command a battalion simply because his father wrote a cheque is laughable, a relic of a bygone era. Yet the shadows of the purchase system linger in the regimental histories and the silver messware of the great cavalry units. They serve as a reminder of a time when the sword was mighty, but the guinea was mightier. When we study military history, we are often drawn to the what, the flanking maneuvers, the cavalry charges, the last stands. But the how and the why are often found in the dry pages of financial history. The story of the purchase system teaches us that an army is a reflection of the society that spawns it. A society obsessed with class and wealth produced an army of landlords and tenants. A society that began to value industry and efficiency produced an army of professionals. The £7 million Britain spent in 1871 was perhaps the best investment it ever made. It bought more than just the end of a corrupt practice, it bought the future. It ensured that when the great storms of the 20th century arrived, the British soldier would be led by men who had earned the right to stand at the front. So, the next time you see a painting of a redcoat officer, resplendent in gold and scarlet, look closer. Ask yourself, did he earn that sword, or did he buy it? The answer tells you everything you need to know about the rise, the near fall, and the eventual redemption of the British military machine. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden economics of history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We'll be uncovering more forgotten stories from the archives soon. Let us know in the comments. Do you think the purchase system had any saving graces, or was it purely a liability? Thanks for watching.